In the movie Saving Private Ryan, we see the storming of Normandy Beach by the 29th Infantry Division and the 2nd and 5th Rangers. As movie scenes go, it's brutal. From the moment the troop carries open their doors, American soldiers are dying. Bullets ricochet off metal. The Allies charge past the anti-tank barricades as machine guns rip through the sand. They hunker under the sand dunes. And that's when we get the turning point. Our plucky heroes begin grenading the bunkers, creating smoke screens. Allied soldiers adapt, overcome, and retake the beach by burning the Nazis out of the Omaha bunkers. And that's where the invasion ends. The D-Day siege is over. The movie goes off in a new direction. For the next 2.5 hours, we're searching for a missing private miles away in the French town of Ramel. A town which, by the way, is totally made up. Ramel was invented so the movie could have its dramatic final battle a few days after Normandy Beach in a place that didn't exist. Which is a shame, because we missed a lot of the real action that took place after the landing. In reality, the push inland continued for nearly a week. The Germans weren't fleeing from Tom Hanks and his rifle company. They were running from the non-stop shelling. Fun fact, according to J. Ellis's data book of World War II, around 75% of all casualties were from mortars and bombs, not bullets. In movies, mortars are the background noise while men with rifles do the real fighting. In reality, rifles merely keep the enemy pinned down while artillery does the killing. If the camera was somehow forced to give the equal screen time to everyone at the battle, most of it would have been on the ships, not on the fictional town. Our story would be about the 7 U.S. and British battleships that kept the Germans on the run, with wave upon wave of 14 and 15-inch shells for 11 straight days. The USS Texas in particular rained so many shells on the fleeing Germans, it spent weeks worth of ammo in the first 35 minutes of the landing. The Texas even left to reload at the nearest port before coming back to put more craters into the French landscape. What would be our movie climax? What's our Ramel? That would have to be the moment the USS Texas realized most of the Germans were too far inland to hit. The Allied troops still needed support. The Nazis needed to be pushed out of France, but the Texas was just out of range. So the captain ordered his own battleship compartments to be flooded. On June 15th, the other British and American battleships parked along the coastline watched as a ship the size of a small floating city began to list. Her starboard torpedo blister was flooded. The ship's hull tilted, forcing the men on deck to walk at a slight angle. And the 14-inch guns boomed for one more day. You're listening to The Re-Engineered You. This is a podcast about self-empowerment and all the myths, lies, and misconceptions we tell ourselves. Then we use science and history to bust those myths and re-engineer a better you. I'm your host, Todd Laments, the extrovert.
And I'm the writer, researcher, and introvert, Joe Anthony, whose job it is to dig through the outer layer of no duh on the internet.
It's called a lot of things in business. Challenging your beliefs, being open to opportunities, realigning your focus. All these are fancy ways of saying making new options for yourself. But guess what? That's not what the human brain is wired to do. Human brains effectively evolved to develop one trade, live in one town, and iterate on their abilities within a well-defined framework. Cavemen hardly ever migrated. They hunted the same game all their lives, and they were rarely asked to develop 10 different resumes to highlight the best job skills for different hiring managers. That's our focus of today's episode, and our myth today. Myth 1. Geniuses like Warren Buffett say the key to success is saying no to almost everything. We're also told success is about creating more options. Can both of these philosophies coexist? Myth 2. We're making lots of claims about the brain's inability to track moves in the game of life. But is there really a built-in limit? Myth 3. Whether we're a ship at sea or a desk in the corner cubicle, how do we make a practice out of creating options? Is there a secret mental muscle to develop?
I'm going to ask about a movie, and it's a bit old. Todd, have you ever seen the movie Half-Baked?
I have not.
Okay. There is a...
I've heard of it. It's got a cult following, right?
Yeah. You may have even seen the scene I'm about to talk about. There is a scene where one of the characters finally leaves his crappy fast food job so that he can go sell, an extremely potent strain of weed full time. It's going to make him all the money. And so he is fed up with his job, and he turns and he says, fuck you, fuck you, fuck you. You're cool. I'm out. And it's such a hilarious yet satisfying scene. I see it and I hear it whenever somebody is about to be fired, or they're about to leave their job, or just if they want to cut ties. It's the idea that you're going to work up to a point where you're able to tell people no, and to walk out forever, and it to slam those doors behind you on places that you don't want to be anymore.
I call this you didn't just burn the bridge. You swam back across the river and kicked your boss in the head a few times. You want to make sure you won't be hired back at this job.
Right.
You're burning your boats in battle. There will be no surrender.
Right. That's not just burning the bridge. That's using C4. So, now we kind of, as an introvert, that appeals to me. I want you to know that it feels better for me mentally to close doors behind me and to tell people goodbye forever when I leave work. Like the menial jobs I've had, I've never even thought about reaching back and contacting those people. Now,
it's like the comedian that says, the comedian who says, "What is this 2-week notice stuff? So you're going to let me work here for 2 weeks, knowing I'm going to quit, and you're still going to pay me? You know I'm going to do a half-assed job if I'm halfway out the door."
Right. It's funny you even say that. When I talk about, closing doors behind you, I gave a 2-week notice at one of my jobs, and they thanked me, and then 2 days after that, they fired me. Not because I was doing a poor job, but just because they didn't want to take risks that I would, harbor ill will or anything like that. So there are companies where even if you give them that loyalty, they will still sort of throw sand in your face.
I worked for years in auto finance, and it was a good job. And when you give your notice, you're privy to a lot of information, Social Security numbers, financial stuff on the company. So when you give your 2-week notice, and you know that they're going to cut you loose that second, they literally come and snatch up your laptop, and they do the Men in Black thing, wave the thing in your face so you can't remember anything. But you get paid for those 2 weeks, so it's important that you still give your 2 weeks. So it's your 2 weeks free pay. It's wonderful,
Right. Well, the concept of today's episode, what we really want to talk about is, I have started seeing a trend with my most successful friends. I do the half-baked thing where I tell everyone where they can shove it on my way out the door. Even if I'm going to be friends with them, I'll pick one person at work when I leave a job who I'm going to keep in contact with, and I add them to my Christmas card list / my Discord channel so they can talk to me regularly. But that kind of closed doors behind you, even if it's on people, jobs, resumes, old contacts, whatever it is, it can even be just emails or forums that you used to go to. I have started realizing that is narrow and reductive thinking. And to define reductive, reductive is tending to present a subject or problem simplified. Like it can also be thought of as crude.
Is it though? Is it a sign of maturity? For me personally, I'm a salesperson. I run on emotion only, no logic. Logic is out the window. And when you're in a toxic relationship, and a lot of those are work relationships, and isn't it nice to have that FU thing and burn that bridge? Especially with especially if they're romantic interests or whatever. They're bad for you. Don't you want to punch them one time before you leave? Isn't it worth it?
Yes, I want to emotionally, definitely, and like movies have taught me that that's what geniuses do. Like if I follow what fiction, like what the docudramas of Steve Jobs, or if I watch the Social Media, the movie, or if I watch really anything about these troubled geniuses who start up companies and become amazing people, it shows them closing doors on people. They do it in such interesting, and like they usually say something very witty and very funny and very quick and absolutely cutting. Like they slay the other person socially before they walk out the door and they never talk to him again. But I'm starting to see in my real life how geniuses actually function. They don't do that. They will sort of sit back and watch somebody implode, like if they think that they're a hot mess, but they're not cutting people off left and right. They're not closing doors for their own comfort. When they check things off of a list, they keep the list around. When they finish a project, they keep things open. Like the geniuses I know, they embrace the discomfort of doors open behind them and windows, and then they make portholes. Draftiness and leaks be damned. They just keep everything open. And that, as an introvert, troubles my mind. Like it actually hurts to watch, like somebody putting puzzle pieces, into the wrong slots on purpose.
You're suggesting maturity, and I hate that term, emotional intelligence, but the long game, right?
Yeah,
the
game. Maturity. It's a professional maturity that I don't think I will ever be used to or enjoy. I like the 1950s version.
Your writing circles, Joe.
Yeah, go ahead.
In your writing circles, Joe, too, I think that we think that whatever business we're in is an ocean. A lot of times they're not. They're swimming pools.
Yeah.
And you are going to have contact, and you are going to need these people. Even though it doesn't feel like it right now, you're going to need them later, and they're going to need you as well. It's kind of a loss,
Right. The more busy you get in life and the more professional projects you are spinning at any one given time, the more you wish you had that person who had a very uninteresting, unimportant skill at the time. You wish you could tap them and just say, hey, could you do this for me? Because you're going to do it 3 times as fast as I can and better than I can.
What were you saying about the 50s? You went back to the 50s there for a second. I cut you off.
Well, the simple like Mad Men 50s version of this is you just have like a list of people you send a bottle of whiskey every year, and if you're on that list of 100 people you do that to, then that's your network. But we're far beyond that at this point. We're into hundreds of friends on Facebook and thousands of friends on social media and stuff. So we want to also say that we are not necessarily describing social media. We're not saying you need to keep all your doors and windows open for social media. That's just asking to have your time burglarized. But in your real life, in your professional life, I'm starting to see. I'm gonna name drop somebody here. We got this episode concept because I was sort of watching how one of the friends of the show, Chris Wilkes, treats people, and I mean that in a very positive way. I mean that like he keeps tabs on people and he messages them, and it looks from the outside like it's exhausting, but I think people get used to it. You, Todd, since you've been in sales for so long, how do you do that? Like, how do you do that without that being like your day job?
Well, just to touch on the Chris Wilkes thing, Chris Wilkes is a connector. I go to a lot of his parties, as you have as well, Joe. And it's funny. It seems like all his friends are just so pre-screened and so interesting. You think, how can there be this many interesting people at a party? And he networks, and without social media, we're going to have him on the show as a guest soon. He connects people who are experts in, and I don't say genius, throw the genius word around, but the head of their fields and what they do. and it's really fun to be around. And you just think this can't be easy to do, to get all this kind of people together this consistently all the time.
Right. I think that is maybe the secret hidden title of this episode is what the hell are connectors doing that I'm not doing. But we actually do want to explore the what our mind is built for, and why not everyone does this, why this isn't standard operating procedure for every type of brain. You had a phrase in sales, didn't you? That like you said it to me in the car a couple months back. He doesn't like me, but he knows me.
This is very well known. What it means is, I'll give you an example, Joe. You've known someone you've worked with, or known someone in your life, a friend who you've known for so long, almost too long. Let's say think of someone that you've worked with for years. And sometimes you work with somebody, it becomes kind of like a marriage. You can be kind of critical of them. But when you have a lot of history with somebody, as humans, we get a natural trust. This is someone who dresses up and shows up. We know that. We would bet our life on that. We would count on Joe or Todd, this person we worked with. And what's nice about that is you don't like them, but you know them.
Yeah.
Is you know their strength and their weaknesses probably better than they do. And so when you're thinking of that next position, you are going to eliminate their weaknesses, but you think their benefits are going to be worth it. And that's why it's good to have and keep those doors open, because even though they're not the favorite person, at least they know they can count on Joe. They know what they can get out of Joe, and that's very valuable in relationships and in business.
I have the perfect example of that. When I was working in side gigs in law enforcement, I was doing sort of odd jobs, and I met a guy who was I worked with him for years. He was a ex-cop, and he worked in investigations, and he was the worst person to work with. Like I worked with him for years. He was always a curmudgeon. He was always sort of like stiff-lipped. Nobody around him did the job as well as they should. He barely spoke a kind word toward his coworkers, but was extraordinarily patient and kind with outside clients and anybody who was coming through the door. And I remember thinking, like, I would never sit and have lunch with this guy. But the moment we went to sort of training, like outside training, like we were surrounded by 100 people we didn't know from different aspects of different fields. Suddenly we're sitting together, and I'm like, I'd prefer to hang out with this guy. Like, I'd prefer to hang out with the curmudgeon who I know, and I know all their strengths and weaknesses, rather than introduce myself to 100 new people and possibly have to work with them and not know what they're going to bring to the table.
You really don't. And boss I had a long time ago, who I hated, this guy got on my nerves. He said this quote, and I don't like anything that he believes in, but turned out to be so true. He said, when you hire somebody, you're hiring their home life, whether you like it or not. And that's just so true.
Yeah. So can we talk about, like, what are the limits of your brain? And we're just going to sort of like very quickly go through, here are how many things you can keep in mind, how many people you can keep in mind. Like we want to get to, what are the benchmarks of our brain's processing power first, so we know what the limits are before we get into, how do you do this? How do you do this constant connecting?
So what you're talking about is how many friends we can have on Facebook, how many people we could remember their names, how many relationships we can juggle.
Right.
If we're not Chris Wilkes, if we're normal people, right?
If we are ordinary mortals, and we have to actually go up and it takes us time to memorize people's names and what they're about. Do you remember the episode where we talked about Dunbar's number?
I do. It stuck with me. If I remember, it's a number. I remember somewhere around $140.
Yeah, it's about 150, give or take. But the idea is that all social primates have a upper limit of how many people they can keep in their mind. And when I say people, I don't mean like 1,000 people on your Facebook list where you can remember their name and roughly what their personality is like. It's more about like they occupy a space in your mind as a full entity. Like you have a sense of them emotionally. You can remember their face. You can connect their name to it. You know a couple things about their family. And Dunbar talked about how it's about 150. If you get too high above that, you start having to corporate offices split at around 150. Like when they go over that number, to keep things streamlined and to keep things working, connected well within the inside, they split above 150. They usually stay around that number. Same thing with close-knit communities. If you look at like Amish and Mennonite communities, they naturally kind of like split off into two communities to keep it around that number or lower.
And Robin Dunbar, just so everybody knows, is a very brilliant British psychiatrist who's a specialist,
like a primate researcher.
Yeah, he's an expert in behavior. He studied it his whole life, and he's worth listening to, right?
Right. So that has Dunbar's number. I've been hip to that since Cracked jokingly referred to it as the monkey sphere, and that has given me an excuse throughout my entire life now to only really keep track of about 150 people at once. And after that, I just throw up my hands. I'm like, well, it's outside my Dunbar number. Like I don't have the capacity for that.
I make cuts. I make cuts all the time. I love cutting people out of my. I say you are dead to me. You are no longer important enough for me to remember who you are.
Yeah, I'll be like, I'm sorry, you were 161, so you are. Yeah, you are out.
You're not as cute as you used to be. You're out.
Now, if we want to keep track of small things, we can only, like, say in our working memory, meaning like our immediate, eyes in front of us memory. Like if we want to memorize a phone number, or if we want to think of, how many tasks we have to do in this immediate moment. There's, you're cooking in the kitchen, and you have to do 10 things to get dinner ready. How many things can you immediately put your hands on and think of in that moment? How many multitasks can you actually multitask? And that number, according to Life Science, is about 3 or 4. You can jump quickly to higher numbers. You can completely put your attention on a different group of tasks, but you can only keep track parallel of about 3 or 4 different tasks or numbers or subjects. In fact, when it comes to like phone numbers and stuff, there's a reason why phone numbers are capped at like 7 numbers, because we generally can't remember strings of things that well either, unless we like use a mnemonic device or something. So generally speaking, the reason why we have sort of limits on how many people we communicate with, and why it feels good to get rid of things, like not just people, but why it feels good to cross something off of your to-do list, why it feels good to stop cooking, like when you finally put the fish in the pan and the only thing to do now is wait for it to sear so that you can serve it. The reason why it feels good to narrow your options, your brain gives you a reward for it. You get a little bit of dopamine when you complete stuff, is because it takes mental effort to do these things, to keep simultaneous people or tasks in mind. It actually takes processing power, and your brain is an efficient machine. It wants to limit that. Like it wants to burn less calories, do things more efficiently. So we don't, by default, create options. Like we don't go through life creating options. That's how you get errand fatigue, which also known as option paralysis, choice overload. Basically, Todd and I had an errand fatigue episode, and it was all about how if you keep too many bills in the air, or how companies basically capitalize on our limited processing power.
You can't read every small print. You can't. It's impossible.
Yeah.
There's not enough time in the day, and you don't have the energy. Does some of the lesson in this creating options too, Joe, based on if you have a very, very needy, toxic partner work problem? I mean, can that really drain? Can one person drain down your number and just sewer and soil your relationships because you're putting so much time thinking and working with someone who's difficult?
Oh, absolutely. So I'm not going to speak for anybody, but I've noticed the connectors in my life who are good at being connectors, they seem to pick people, like you said, not only do they do what our friend Chris Wilkes does, where they pick people who look like they're professionals or they're operating at a at the top of their field. They also pick people who are low maintenance, or people who are not going to absolutely absorb their attention and their resources. Which that sounds like it is a Machiavellian play. Like it's like pick people who aren't going to drain you too much. But honestly, you can't be a connector at that level without doing that. You have to vet people who are not going to become part of your errand paralysis.
Well, how do you do that, Joe? Joe's very sought after to help, and I've abused him a bit on that, on referring him with friends and stuff to work on presentations, speeches, just overall communication. Joe always likes to help people. He's a fixer, He's a know-it-all. But how do you say no to people, Joe? Because you get more. You can't help everybody. I guarantee there's more people in line, and can't be easy.
I have like stages, and this I've always kind of blamed on being an introvert, but now I'm starting to see that professionals generally do this. If it is something where they want advice, I will give them resources. Like I'll cut aside a small bit of time, 30 minutes to an hour, and I'll have lunch with them, and I'll talk to them, and I'll see what they're up to and what they're about and what they're working on. But after that, the way it usually goes is they will either have something concrete they want help with, or they want to be my friend and they want time. I try to limit my interactions to mammoth hunting. I will tell people, if you have a mammoth to slay, if we are going after game, I will definitely jump in and help. There's only so many like projects people can work on, speeches they can give, stories they can write. So that actually helps me limit how much time I give out. If somebody comes to me with a short story they want to bring into a contest, I'll give them an hour to sort of like talk it out with them and outline and figure out where it's going and how to structure it. Same thing with a speech. This is going to sound so maybe egotistic of me to say, but not a lot of people that I've met want to actually do the work. So when I say, hey, I'm going to be here for the next project you work on, go ahead and call on me. Not a lot of people actually take me up on that. The people who do, we end up working on really interesting, amazing stuff. I mean, like when I talk about, working on like city planning stuff, not working on, but like advising on minutia of. And when I talk about, meeting people who are like in agriculture or chatting with people who are going to Toastmasters, that's always how it is they actually have taken me up on my offer and we end up working on something interesting or strange.
Joe's been trying to fade me out for 4 years, and I'm still fucking here, man.
That's because you keep taking me up on my offer. Every time I'm like, yeah, let's write a book. Or
you wish I would quit.
Yeah, sure, when you work on a speech, let's do something. And then every time you come back with an actual thing to work on. So I'm like, okay, I got to change my policy. How do you do it? Like how do you limit your interactions, or do you? Like you have so many friends. I can't imagine. Do you have like a structured set of how much time you give people?
I do. I think I hand them off a lot. Right now, I'm in the process of. I'm very proud of. I've probably introduced to date about 7 married couples, and I got a couple that are probably closing in on that. So, right the other day, I was talking to a very attractive woman, and she was talking about being single, and I said, I have a lot of friends who are handsome and rich and tall, and she said, "You're gonna introduce me?" And I said, "Yes, I will." So I think that's a lot of it. I try to kind of blend my friend group together, because I have found that I kind of think of it like a school teacher. The problem a school teacher has, you have 30 students in your class. You got 2 bright, brilliant students, and you got 2 misbehaved students, and they get all your attention. So I try to limit my time, because I just have to preserve my energy. But I still want everybody on my team or in my inner circle to feel loved. So it's tough. It's not easy. It takes constant effort.
You do it how people do when they have a misbehaving dog. Like you see that your pet wants all of your attention, and so you're like, I'll just get him another pet. I'll get a second dog to keep him busy.
I guess so. I never thought of it like that.
So, okay, when you're working on projects, like ongoing, do you try to put them to bed? Like, do you go for the satisfaction of like crossing things off your list? Even if it's just like
I do.
you're tangentially related, like they're not necessarily yours, but they're you're tied to it.
I respect in others people who see things all the way through, who complete tasks, and I don't like to start things unless I know I'm going to finish them. So it's easier for me to say no to something, and I've gotten better at that, or just avoiding it, being avoidant, than not seeing it all the way through. I want to be a closer. I want to be a finisher. The big thing that Joe and I work on is speeches, and the nice thing about a speech is when you have a deadline, you got to make it. If you have a book deadline or a writing deadline, deadlines at work are easy, but on creative projects and things you do outside of work, where there's not a boss or a customer telling you have to do it, paying you, you have to be disciplined.
Yeah. And it helps to have a deadline, not because it puts pressure on you necessarily, but because there is now going to be a time where this project is over. Like whether you succeed or not, this will be crossed off your list, which for me, like you said, closing, it feels nice. Like that's
progress. Progress is everything, Joe.
Would you believe it if I told you that satisfaction, if you make a decision, especially about like a project or a person, if it is reversible, it makes us less happy?
Really?
I would think it would be the opposite. I would think that, if you buy a vase, that being able to bring it back at any time and get the one you actually wanted or to change your mind, that would make us more satisfied. Like having options, being able to reverse, like being able to undo the mortgage you just got, or like undo. I mean, I'm gonna
the marriage.
Yeah, like how
that's what everyone's thinking.
How big can we go?
I gotta undo this relationship.
Yeah. So that's
or even what you studied in college, even what you studied, what you majored in, and what you got a career in. You're like, I shouldn't have done this. I should have tried something else. I should have been a teacher,
right?
Not a nurse.
You would think that we would like reversible decisions, but I found a study that we're going to link off to about photography students, and the study basically tested them to show that like they can keep a print like of what they had done or what somebody else had done. Like they get to pick a print to keep in their home to hang it up, and people who had the opportunity to change their minds with their prints, they were less satisfied. So like they would pick the one they want just like the other students, but if they were able to change their minds, whether or not they did change their mind, they would take it home regardless. If they knew that they could change their mind, they were less satisfied. The people who had to pick once and stick with it, they actually were more satisfied. They reported more satisfaction because they had to, like, it was theirs. Like I think that is the big separation here in our minds is we actually don't want the decision so much afterward. We want a thing to be owned by us, and that includes goals, projects, people. Like if it's not reversible, then we own it. We have to. Like we have to add that to our narrative personally.
There's something to be said for that. Every time you pass, the academics, they get another letter or initials by their name, right?
Right.
You don't take that. You don't lose that. You'll always be doctor. You can't take that away from you.
If that was reversible and you could get rid of letters and add other ones to it, that would be
inmate number 1265.
Right.
I guess you can, but overall they stick with you till you die. They'll
do.
be on your obituary that you were a published best-selling author. Yeah, that'll be on your obituary someday, Joe.
Someday. So when you drive home, how much does your brain go on autopilot, by the way?
Always. Sometimes I don't even realize. I mean, I drive so much that it's just a pattern. I don't even, sometimes I don't think I'm even watching the road.
Yeah.
You?
I do it with walking, with driving. I do it with going room to room. Like, honestly, because I blame writing, but now I'm starting to just think it might be brains in general. I used to think that because I was always so focused on writing fantasy and coming up with stories and thinking about movies and what plots didn't work, I never see my environment around me truly. Like I can enjoy walking in nature and I can enjoy seeing things around me and being in a comfortable space and in my house. But my brain is on autopilot all the time. And I think I deeply suspect this is part of the reason why we don't create options everywhere we go. Our mind wants to be as efficient as possible. We don't have the processing power to recognize everything on the street as we drive down it, especially if we've been there 100 times. So our brains tune those things out, simplify things, and let us sort of like dissolve into this like daydreaming kind of state.
Hey, you ever had this where it's a neighborhood that you frequent? I mean, you know it like the back of your hand, and then a friend will take you to a restaurant and it's in a subdivision or, a business park. The food is wonderful, and you're like, why have I never even noticed this restaurant? You never saw the sign. I mean, you've driven past it thousands of times, and you just never ever saw it. It's just not in your brain pattern. So we're predisposed to save calories and simplify our life, right? And not just keep looking for everything and trying to pay attention to every single sign, sentence, person. We can't. We gotta.
Right. And if you go around creating options as sort of a matter of like professional habit, you undo that. Like you pull on that tapestry of unconscious autopilot and you unwind it. And the reason why is because if you are talking to somebody who you like, if you have 300 people on your contact list and every time you go out to lunch, you bring somebody or talk to somebody you haven't spoken to in months, that every single time you do that, that is a new experience. That is forcing you to pay attention, forcing you to be connected and engaged every time you take on something else that is, not in your normal day to day. Like you're ruining that autopilot, and I hate it, and I wish we would stop trying to do it on this podcast. Todd, you've dragged me into something. Also, I find it interesting that, like, of all of the stories that we kept running into of, like, when we looked for a narrative of here are people who found just absolutely wild, unconventional solutions, that exists everywhere. There's not, it's not like we're saying that doesn't exist in medicine or being a lawyer or something. Like any profession you look into, regardless, you're going to find people who are extraordinarily skilled at finding unconventional solutions and finding new ways to operate. But for some reason we kept gravitating, because I think it's because I've read too much about World War II, but the things people did to overcome like obstacles. I mean, like our opening narrative is about the USS Texas flooding its own tanks or flooding its own deck to make the ship start tilting so they could shoot farther, which is just madness. Like that's straight up, it's crazy.
And for the captain to make that call,
Yeah.
The USS Texas, think about it, flooding its own ship so it could tilt and get in shallower water so it could attack. I mean, that's the leadership is making that call, and you would think that the crew would have been like, "Are you crazy?"
Yeah.
There's the money and lives at stake. The stakes are very high.
Seeing the German front line fleeing deeper into France and being like, there sure are a lot of Germans out there, and I sure wish we could still drop bombs on them after having done this for 2 days. What if we were sinking? Like, it sounds like a drunk person's logic.
It does, and also we know the history of the Barb, which is a famous submarine. It was ran by Captain Flunky, and Swish Sanders was the co-captain or the second in charge. And the Barb has an amazing, amazing history. Some of its wins, it used to be that submarines before the Barb would just sit and wait. But
like
the Barb started being more aggressive. It wouldn't lay in wait. It would attack. It was aggressive. One time it surfaced underneath a Japanese boat and snapped it in half. Can you think of that?
That is, yeah.
And
That's funny.
And it was one of the first. They've always used torpedoes on submarines, which is the that goes through the water. We know what torpedoes are, but the Barb was one of the first one to start using rockets and start attacking. It actually even sunk a Japanese train, a moving target of a Japanese train, which was only done once in history, and it was in World War II. Now, the Captain Flunkey, we've studied him. What was that other episode we did about Flunkey? What was the topic of it? What was the takeaway?
Entourages, and it was how he had built his team to do all these wild, unconventional things. Like he literally rewrote the book about submarine warfare. Before this, they were kind of like a neat tool that the military used to catch ships that were unawares while they waited at the bottom of the ocean. Flunkey made them into a full tool of war, and we covered an entire episode on it because his crew was insane. The people doing this were crazy.
They were. So this is the thing. He was a huge, big-time planner. So he's surrounded, before he took over the Barb as the captain, he worked on different kinds of ships. So he knew the limitations of different ships. So as in his career, he worked on battleships and aircraft carriers. He plucked the perfect men, not the high in ranking. He got his best people, and he hired them and got them to work for him on the Barb. He ended up sinking more Japanese ships than any other submarine because he had a dream team of officers and enlisted men. Now, most submarine captains, they only got 4 tours, Joe. That was the limit. That was the government limit. That was the U.S. limit. Flunkey got 5. Now, usually you want to quit while you're still, we say quit while you're ahead, quit while you're still alive, right?
Right.
If we're talking about war captains. But you think of what an honor that is to be, I'm the only captain that got 5 tours. And he was doing dangerous missions. He was more aggressive than most. So he was cheating death with him and his men more than most.
In the book, it talks about the bets he would make. He'd come back to the Admiralty, and they'd be like, "How many ships you get?" And he's like, 8. And they're like, "It wasn't 9 though." And he'd say, "No, I'm gonna get more." And every time he went out, his tours would be longer and longer, and he would get more enemy ships. It was, it felt like reading a adventure novel. It was crazy.
Well, one of his greatest compliments, I think, came from the Japanese, from the enemy at the time. Their leadership said they were sure that they were being attacked by at least 6 vessels, but it turns out it was only the Barb.
Yeah.
It was raining hell on them, and it was such a famous ship and such famous results from all the wins. Everyone loves a winner. Well, FDR and Ted Roosevelt, 2 presidents, both kept tabs on the Barb and wanted to know about what it was doing at all times because they were big fans.
Oh yeah, they were fanboys.
Now, not the most important thing about them was not only that they had more successful battle missions, they had more dangerous missions than everyone. Joe, they didn't lose 1 life. Their whole crew was intact for their whole naval career during World War II, which is unheard of. It's a very dangerous business. Now, what kind of broke my heart about this is this, and I know it's just, the Barb sold when it was decommissioned. It sold for $100,000. Okay? Now, I think this thing should be honored. I think this should be in Washington, D.C., at some big monument right next to Abraham Lincoln or FDR. Just to give you some context for that. Today, if you were to build a nuclear sub, 1 nuclear sub costs $3 billion. So I think it's worth it for $100K for us to have this on display and tell the history of why we're not speaking German and Japanese in this country anymore. We're speaking English.
Right. Who bought the Barb? I mean, I know why somebody would want to buy it, but who owns it now? Do you happen to know that?
I don't know. I'm thinking maybe it's one of the drug cartels or something that runs cocaine up to. I don't know.
That would be a movie. That would be somebody captaining the Barb, this extraordinarily heroic ship, and now they're running drugs in it or something leaky. So there is, when I went looking for, first I went looking for science of how do we become better connectors, how do we keep options open, how do we make a constant mental practice of keeping our options open in a way that is like professionally mature. And first I went science and then I went philosophy because I wanted to know, how do people do this throughout history? One of the answers that you might encounter is Buddhism. There are a lot of warm, fuzzy, comfortable Buddhist sayings, like, challenge your ideas about how things should work, or look for opportunities in tough situations. And a lot of Buddhism is about open-mindedness and keeping things in the air. But that's not as practical day-to-day as what I was looking for. So instead, I turned toward psychologist Albert Bandura, who just talks about self-efficiency. And they believe that, when you're creating options, believe you're going to get there, and acknowledge to yourself and everyone else that uncertainty involves having to experiment and get things right. That sentiment there kind of started reconstructing my brain with how to create options. Like I see, professionally adept connectors in my life. They don't look uncertain to me. They don't look like the people who would let an email sit unread for 6 months and then look at it and say, oh my God, I forgot to get back to them. They don't look like the type of person who will like get a text and then put their phone down and then go answer that text, a week later. That's me, by the way. I'm describing how bad I am at being a connector and how bad I am at keeping my options open. But the idea is that, if you think about your practice of creating options more about an exercise, it's more like you are creating options as an exercise day to day, and less about being so wired tight that you're constantly answer your emails right away, answer your texts right away, get everything correct. It's less about being correct, and it's more about the exercise of opening yourself up to options and trying to communicate with people as often as you can.
I think that you're open that this is a good point, Joe, about communication. And how do you feel if someone doesn't respond to your email for a few weeks or a few days? Do you feel that they're so important that they're doing other things, or do you feel devalued that you're not? And then how do you walk that line? Sometimes I'm over polite and getting back to people too fast, to the point that I rush the information that I'm getting back to them, and I don't think it all the way through, because I'm afraid that they're going to think that they're not important to me because I didn't get back to them right away. How do you balance and manage that?
Right.
Because we all have different rules, right, for when to respond to a text, and and you don't want someone to feel unloved or uncared for or whatever,
Yeah. So I don't want to like out myself as being very, very, very old. I used to read etiquette books from like the peerage age, and it would be like you're only supposed to attend parties 45 minutes after they start, and it's not being rude. It's showing that you have high value, and it's because you want to give the host plenty of time to like set up the party as it's going. Like I went through my sort of like OCD adult life with these ideas, like an introvert thinking that you could just follow a code or a rubric or a series of actions, like somebody had computer coded me to do things correct socially. And the better way to sort of put your mind into it is something Harvard Business Review calls it construal. Construal is thinking that your actions have bigger meaning or purpose than what you're actually doing. So for me, what I'm thinking of is I just need to answer my damn emails and my texts, and I need to call people who have contacted me. And I make a list out of it, and I mentally just go through and tick those boxes. What I should be doing is I should be construing them as something that serves a higher purpose, which is I am creating a support network in my life, and I am making sure that people know I'm the resource, that that I'm available as a resource to them, especially if I like them. And that goes for everything. With like any options you create in life, you should use construal. You should try to think of it as not that you're throwing doors open and making your life more hectic and that you are giving yourself air and fatigue. You should think of it as, voting is just ticking a box and hoping policy gets changed. Instead, think of it as I'm participating in democracy and I'm hopefully part of the outcome. Or, we're in our example, of the USS Texas, they could have just thought, we're just lobbing exploding shells at the enemy to make them run. But what they actually thought of is, we're liberating occupied France by giving our troops one more day of artillery cover. Like, there's always a construal way to think about things. If you construe things in a more action-oriented, more inspired, more motivated way, you can start opening options all over the place, and it doesn't feel fatiguing. It doesn't make you feel dread like I have when I look back at my unresponded text messages.
I'm glad that Adequate book helped you. I could just see you sipping tea and walking with a book around your head, walking around the house practicing. But I think you're right, Joe. I think what I've been hearing you say too is you're focused on winning, the reward, the dopamine, and the connection, right? You have to kind of create that carrot too, I think, and not look at it as like a chore, but look at it as a connection.
Yeah. And feel okay about having things stay open. Like one of you and I, we've talked on this podcast about hospital debt, and how we're going to have an episode, in fact, about just how much this country runs off debt in general, of all types. But I think I told you once that I was uncomfortable because I owed the hospital a bunch of money, and I paid them because I needed to cross them off my list. Like, it was causing me stress, and I needed to have that box checked. But what ended up happening is I messed myself up badly because my union was going to fight them. Like, my union was getting ready to pay them, but also to battle with them about how much they were charging. And if I just let my insurance and my union slug it out like Godzilla fighting Mothra, it would have been fine. Like, I would have just sat back and let them do it. Instead, I ended up costing myself a tremendous amount of money because I needed to have that checked off my list. Have you ever burned any bridges or settled up when it was satisfying but unnecessary?
I have. Yeah. We talked about earlier when you burn bridges, and then in time it seems to heal a little bit. People will romanticize or misremember the tough times. I think that they kind of give you a pass and they forgive. But my advice for anybody younger than me in a corporate world or in any relationships, I like to do the work stuff, money, because I like money we can measure. Connection's hard to measure, and friends and loved ones it's hard to really put that in a box, right?
Right.
But I don't want you to ever burn any bridges, and I want to keep options open in business, and I'll tell you why. It isn't just the hiring managers, and that's who we usually put our focus on. That's usually where lots of our pain is from, and that's where we put a lot of our hate and, the FU when I'm out the door. But I can honestly tell you, how you act and how you behave and how you connect with your coworkers, I promise you, Joe, you're going to be shocked at how many of those are the next hiring managers and the next business owners and the next CEOs. It's the people you work with, the very average Andys and average Ashleys, that end up being bosses that someday you're going to need a job from. You're going to need something from. And they're going to need you because they might not like you, but they know you. And they're not going to remember your work,
right,
Joe, as much as they're going to remember your attitude. Settling a dispute, reaching a goal, deleting old emails, paying off old debts. We get a lot of satisfaction from shutting doors and completing our checklist. Humans are natural, reductive thinkers. We like to close our case files as often as possible, not open new ones. But there are gifted folks out there who are capable of more Buddhist-like approach to work and relationships. People who keep their contact lists open. People who open doors as they wander the hallways of life instead of closing them. We're not suggesting you stop being a completionist or that you leave mountains of work untouched. But sometimes we could be more like the captain of the USS Texas. If we see a goal that's just out of reach, we should squint, tilt our head, and ask, what are my other options? You've been listening to the Re-Engineered You. Thank you so much for listening to the show. You mean the world to us. We have a new episode every week.
You can connect with us at www.re-engineeredyou.com. That's where we have research links, show notes, feedback, and blog articles for each of our episodes.
We're not experts in anything, but we've got an opinion on everything.